funny how sometimes you can learn something new from the most unexpected of places, and that was certainly the case with the painting whose creation process I'm going to be showing you today. And the lesson I came out with from this painting, which in the hundreds that I've done before hadn't struck me, was that emotion can be displayed not only through facial expressions but through hands as well. Now I think maybe even feet can do the job, but it's the first painting I've made which made me reconsider the role of hands in the way we express ourselves. I know it sounds trivial, but in most paintings, when a lot of artists, not just me, are trying to display emotion, we tend to lean heavily towards facial expression. Then hands are used to simply enhance or support the emotion that's already being shown by the face. But in this case, the hands took the center stage. So it's an interesting discovery, at least for me, that I hadn't thought of before. But in this video, I'll be taking you through the process of how I made it. And hopefully you can pick out something deeper than just a painting of the hands that are in the video. Now, sometimes I'm a bit uncreative with the titles, and this was one of those cases. So the title I gave to the painting is The Hands, but to give it a little more juice, I went for a different language. So Las Manos, which is the title of the video, is simply Spanish for the hands. In any case, here's how I painted Las Manos. It started, like most of my paintings, with a flat acrylic background. And on this surface, I usually draw equally shaped rectangles which also appear on the reference image. And I do this in chalk so it would be easy for me to get rid of the grid when I no longer need it. Next up, I'll assemble all the items I'll need for the outline stage, and first on the list, of course, is a nice and thin brush. Not too thin, just thick enough to hold a lot of paint, so I can draw continuous lines without having to reload it every now and then. Then I'll also need a solvent, a plastic plate, and a palette knife. Now I'm going to mix a little oil paints with a lot of solvent until you get a nice viscous fluid that can paint on canvas the same way a pen would do on paper. Following the lines in the reference image in the way that the grid cuts across them, at least the main ones, I'm just going to copy them all on canvas in this stage. And what the grid does is it makes it possible for me to get the proportions right, at least better than I would without it, because the margin of error is reduced with the more boxes that I have. And so when you look at it cumulatively or as a unit at the end of this stage, it's only possible to notice the mistakes in proportion if you literally overlay the original picture on top of these outlines. One advantage of using acrylic as a background, at least when painting with oils, is that since it has a sort of plastic feel when it dries, oil slides really well on top of it. Now that I'm done with the outlines, it's time to get rid of the chalk. After dipping a soft brush in the solvent, I clean it on canvas so that there's just little enough to get rid of the chalk without interfering with the oil paints, because if I flooded the brush with solvent, it would wash away parts of the outlines, but the outline is what I want to remain in this stage. With that done, now it's time for the underpainting. Now I want the brushes to be soft to begin with, so I'll dip them all in water, then dry the excess with a piece of canvas. And remember, these are hard brushes because I'm using them for acrylics. Acrylics would destroy the soft brushes that I'll use later for oils. For the underpainting, which is monochromatic, I'll use two colors: white silk vinyl paint, which has very similar properties to acrylic, and a darker color, which is a mixture of discarded paint from other projects. Next up, I'll create a gradient that goes from the darkest version of this monochrome all the way to the lightest one. Now, I don't want the values in the underpainting to go all the way to either extremes, in other words, black and white, so I'm going to impurify the white when I get to it. Then with the smaller brush, I'm going to start with the darkest color. And now I'll fill up a portion of the canvas with that dark color, and then use that as a guide until I've covered that section before I can move on to the next, and so on until the whole canvas is covered. The reason I didn't want the colors in this stage to go all the way from black to white is so that if either values appear in the final artwork, it will be easy for me to tell which parts I've painted in oils and which parts I haven't. And of course, to assist with this, for the underpainting, I use a color that won't appear in the final layer. So the final layer, for instance, won't have any purple on it. In this stage, I don't have to focus on any details because it's a layer that I'm going to cover anyway. But as long as I have the main values right, that will be just enough to guide me in the next stage. One advantage of using acrylic as an underpainting for oils is that if in future the upper layer is destroyed for whatever reason and it needs restoration, the restorer or the conservator will have something to work with, because acrylics and oils are paints that are made with different pigments, mediums, polymers, plasticizers, etc. So even though it rarely ever happens, if one layer is destroyed, the other one at least has a chance of survival. But a more immediate reason as to why I use acrylics is so that because it dries within minutes of application, I can then move on to the oil paints as soon as I'm done with it. So now it's time to mix the oil paints. I'll start by laying out on my palette all the colors that I think form part of the background, even though they don't appear in this pure form. But with practice, it becomes possible and easier with time to look at any color and figure out what pure colors would possibly give you that mixture. I like to organize the colors on my palettes in a gradient that flows from dark to light, which is a format I find less confusing than if I had the colors all over the place. So with a soft set of brushes, I'm going to start creating the background, and in this case it's blurred, so after applying the paint, I'll go over it again a number of times to smoothen all the borders between the colors. I'll then use the other end of the brush to mark the areas in the foreground that I've painted over with the background color, then get rid of them with a cleaner brush, which is one thing that the slow drying rate of oil paints can allow me to do that I would never be able to do with acrylics, even within 10 seconds of application. Across the other parts of the background, I'll repeat this process of applying paint and smoothening the borders between the colors almost as soon as I've applied them, because even though oil paints dry pretty slowly, different colors and layers that have different thicknesses dry at different rates. And I don't want to run the risk of having a color or a part of the background being drier than the parts around it, which would make it difficult for me to manipulate the borders the way I'm doing here. And now we're on to the middle ground, which is between the background and the foreground, and you can tell that the details are a bit more clear in this part of the painting, even though they're not as extreme as they will be in the next part. So after painting the local color, which is the color of the shirt, I'm going to move on to the shadows, but I won't go straight into the darkest ones first. I'll start with a muted version of the shadows, then I'll simply apply the darkest versions of that color on top of that layer until I've built all the shadows I want to build. Then when I've blurred these lines, I'll do the same with the highlights, but in this case it will be in the other direction. So this soft brush will do the job, then I'll also use it when blurring the highlights when I'm done with them. It will be the same process for this part of the shot as well, and you can probably tell already, the closer an object is to the viewer, the lighter its colors appear, depending of course on how the scene was lit. So in this case, the part that I'm painting right now is closer to the viewer. So after painting the shadows first as dots and smoothing them, I'll do the same with the highlights, but coming from the other direction, because that's how light normally works when an object is lit from one direction. Now for this other cloth, I don't need to fill the whole space with blue, the local color, because most of the sweater is in complete shadow. So I'll fill it with the dominant colors in each part, then blend them into a nice transition. And now you can tell just how much darker the burnt umber, which is the darkest color that I'm using now, is compared to the dark version that I had in the underpainting. So that's part of the point of having the underpainting. It's simply telling me which parts I haven't painted on yet. Anyway, after painting the highlights, this other soft brush will do the job of smoothing them. Then now we are on to the skin color. The 7 colors I have on my palette right now can give you pretty much any skin color you want. From left to right, I have brilliant red, burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, orange, medium yellow, and titanium white. And so now we have ourselves a nice little gradient here. So the color in the middle is going to be the skin color. That's how it normally works, at least in my palette. And this is now the local color. Sometimes I break the rule and start with highlights, even though these are kind of muted, and you'll see why when I'm done with this part. But I'll first move on to the shadows, smoothen them, but with a much smaller brush this time, because I'm not trying to get them completely blurred. And now these are the real highlights. So the first ones that I painted are highlights that I consider to be part of the skin color. Sometimes other colors, depending on how the light has hit the object you're painting, are so dominant that they might as well act as the local color. So it's not set in stone, so to speak, that the method has to be followed to the letter every time. And after I paint the fingernails, now you can see just how the blur and focus effect gives that feeling of distance. So I'm just going to paint the different parts of this hand, and clearly some are simpler than others. Then when I'm done with the details of the thumb, I'll move on to the second person's hand. To create this translucent layer of the local color, I apply very little paint, then spread it thin with kind of a hard brush. And sometimes, especially when I'm doing a much bigger painting than this, I'll add solvent to the brush to spread it even more. And the solvent I'm using for this painting, by the way, is kerosene. Then now that the underpainting is partly visible underneath, I'll just follow those values and darken them gradually until all the areas in shadow are covered. The soft brush will smoothen them, but only where I need that effect. Remember, for the foreground or the hand in the case of this painting, some of it is in full focus, so the lines need to be as clear as they are in real life. Then after highlighting some of the dominant veins, I'll move on to the next hand. So after the big brush, I'll once again move on to a smaller brush to extend its coverage all the way to the edge of the hand where the foreground meets the background. Then repeat the process I just used for the previous hand. There are some results which, to achieve, I'll need to create them when the layer underneath is still wet. So for instance, successfully blending these shadows I'm applying with the local color beneath is easier done when that local color is still wet. But in the case of these clearer lines that will end up forming the wrinkles in the knuckles and in other parts of the skin, I'm gonna need to wait for the layer underneath to dry, because otherwise the solvent or the medium that I'm adding to the paint to make it viscous enough to give me lines this clear, which is the exact same way that I drew the outlines before in the second stage. That solvent may either liquefy, dissolve, or erase the layer underneath if the layer underneath is still wet. So like with everything else, you get to know on a case-by-case basis which approach works best. And now you can see the hand that I'm painting is starting to resemble my hand, although to a much less extent of realism. Of course, this varies from painting to painting. There are some that will need the entire hand to be rendered in a more realistic way. But in this case, for instance, in the reference photo, only the front part of the hands were in focus, and everything else behind it was blurred to different extents the further you travel into the painting. Then of course the brightest highlights always come last, and after this I'll move on to the nails. Now at this point you can maybe start to tell the kind of emotion I was talking about in the beginning of the video, whereby the activity in the painting started to go beyond just a rendering of 3 different hands. This is different to a handshake, and there's a feeling that I felt was brought by with the grip, with the lighting, with the positioning of the hands, with the colors as well. Everything just works together to bring about a certain mood that I didn't think hands had the ability to display on their own. Or maybe I'm reaching in my assumptions, but it's the first time I've seen or imagined emotions expressed first in photography, then in painting as well, by a part of the body other than the face. In any case, after the nails, now we have ourselves a complete painting, although there's still one more thing to be done. You'll notice a certain difference in the reflectiveness or the shininess of the painting in different parts, and this is because I later went over some parts and added some paint because I felt the layers weren't thick enough. And when this happens, the paint dries differently because the first layer in this case was stuck onto acrylic, which absorbed none of the linseed oil that binds the paint, and so it has a shiny luster, but the additional layer will have some of its linseed oil absorbed by the oil paint underneath, and so it will dry into a dull finish. When this happens, even though a painting is complete, it doesn't look presentable. But of course I have to make sure it's completely dry before I clear my floor, place the painting on a sheet of canvas, then find my varnishing brush, which is normally one of the softest brushes I have, but when varnish dries on it, which inevitably happens because a little always remains stuck on the bristles after cleaning, so this is what it sounds like. And that's clearly too dry for use. So I'm going to use some thinner to break the bonds between the varnish and the bristles and soften the brush once again. And now to apply the varnish, I'll first do it in a horizontal movement, then from top to bottom, and doing it this way will ensure that I cover all the spaces or all the pores that I might have missed in the first run-in. But I have to do this quick enough because varnish dries almost as speedily as acrylic does, and if I wait too long, the brush strokes will show on canvas, which I definitely do not want. I want the texture of the canvas to stay put, and in this shot you can see it's done exactly that. And so now we have ourselves Las Manos, the painting that has spoken to me in a different way than other hands I've painted before. And in terms of teaching me something I hadn't realized, you could even say it came in pretty handy, couldn't you? So Las Manos, which is the title, so sorry, there's a truck passing. That is.